When Laura Whitman appeared at a medical facility near Flagstaff in early fall of 2022, she was barely recognizable, gaunt to the bone, severely dehydrated, and had to be supported step by step. The woman had vanished 4 years earlier during a tour of Antelope Canyon, a crowded tourist spot where she was believed to have had an accident and never returned. But what chilled the doctors and police to the bone wasn't the fact that she was still alive. The most terrifying thing was what her emaciated body, panicked eyes, and fragmented silences suggested about those 4 lost years, and about whatever had kept her trapped in the darkness for all that time. Some names and details have been changed to protect identities and privacy. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of the latest cases. On a crisp early winter morning in 2019, the visitor staging area at the entrance to Antelope Canyon, Arizona, was starting to fill up as tour vans pulled in one after another onto the cold, dry red sand in the characteristic desert stillness before peak hours. Laura Whitman, 29 years old, stepped out of her rental car, carefully closed the door, and adjusted her backpack straps before heading toward the official tour assembly area. She had come alone, just as she had traveled for years, trusting that a licensed, guided, and tightly controlled tour would eliminate most risks. According to the tour operator's registration list, Laura joined a group of more than 20 people, mostly couples and families, all of whom were briefed on strict safety rules before entering the narrow deep slot canyon system. Witnesses later recalled that Laura looked no different from the other tourists: neat clothing, basic hiking shoes, a water bottle and phone securely stowed, carrying nothing that suggested any intention to separate from the group. The tour began moving slowly into the heart of the slot canyon, where sunlight was sliced into thin shafts, reflecting off the towering sandstone walls and making direction almost impossible to track after just a few turns. In one secluded section, where the passage narrowed to single-file width, the group ahead paused briefly while the guide explained the terrain, then continued forward. Laura lagged for just a moment. According to a tourist behind her, she stood close to the wall, bending down as if adjusting her shoe or reaching for something in her backpack. The gap between her and the group widened quickly in the confined space, where voices were swallowed and sightlines were blocked by the continuous bends. By the time the group emerged into a wider section of the canyon, heading toward the final gathering point, Laura was no longer at the back. At first, the guide and group members assumed she had moved ahead or accidentally joined another tour, a rare but not unheard of occurrence on busy days. However, when the head count was completed, and no one could account for Laura, concern began to grow. The guide backtracked through the section they had just passed, calling her name repeatedly, but received only hollow echoes from the stone walls. The tour ended in uneasy limbo, and by the end of the day, when Laura failed to appear at any canyon exit or returned to the hotel where she had a reservation, calls from her family began pouring in with no response. Laura's phone could not be reached, messages went unread, and her usual evening check-in call never came. When the tour company confirmed a guest had gone missing during the tour, and the hotel front desk reported she had not returned, Laura's family realized this silence went far beyond an ordinary delay. Just hours later, an official missing person report was filed, documenting that the last time Laura Whitman was seen was inside Antelope Canyon, where she had separated from the group for a brief moment and never rejoined the gathering point. Just a few hours after the missing person report was filed, Antelope Canyon transformed from a bustling tourist spot into an emergency search zone involving multiple agencies, including the Coconino County Search and Rescue Team, Navajo Nation Rangers, local police, and medical personnel on standby, all deployed under rapidly fading light and the complex terrain of the Slot Canyon system. The initial search focused on the official tour route that Laura Whitman had taken, with the primary assumption that she might have become separated from the group or suffered a medical emergency within the canyon, where narrow passages, unstable sandy floors, and sharp turns can cause disorientation in just minutes. Search teams divided the area into segments, meticulously sweeping each slot, each lesser-known side crevice, while checking all natural and man-made escape routes, including steep climbs used only in emergencies. High-powered flashlights were used to probe every nook and cranny, while rangers familiar with the terrain marked hazardous spots, such as slippery rock ledges, hidden deep holes, and areas at risk of collapse. During the sweep, searchers discovered several personal items believed to belong to Laura scattered along a section of slot, not on the main route, including a nearly empty water bottle and a small piece of fabric, matching the color of the clothing she was wearing that morning. These finds initially raised concerns that she might have taken a wrong turn and tried to find her way back, but the fact that the items appeared randomly, without any logical sequence, made the search commanders more cautious about drawing conclusions. The entire area around the items was thoroughly examined for signs of a slip, hard impact, or blood trails that might indicate a serious accident. However, no evidence suggested Laura had suffered severe injury or fallen from a dangerous height. There were no drag marks, no unusual disturbance of sand or rock, and the surrounding surfaces remained in their natural state, making the theory of a major accident inside the canyon less convincing. In parallel with the sweep inside the slot system, other teams expanded the search outward to the surrounding areas, checking parking lots, trails leading into the desert, and places where someone might have wandered while trying to escape the canyon off route. Drones were deployed to scan from above, focusing on areas difficult to reach on foot, but the images captured showed no clear signs of a person in distress or trapped. As night fell, desert temperatures dropped quickly, forcing search teams to temporarily scale back operations and shift to a standby mode, ready to resume as soon as conditions allowed. Laura's family arrived in Arizona quickly after receiving the news, joining the search effort in a state of confusion and anxiety, providing authorities with every possible detail about her habits, health, and state of mind before the trip. They accompanied rangers along already searched sections of the canyon, trying to identify any items that might belong to Laura, while mental health support staff stayed close to ensure the family didn't collapse under the strain of waiting. Throughout those first days of searching, even as the sweep area continued to expand and resources were reinforced, the search and rescue teams found no indication that Laura had suffered a serious accident, nor any direct evidence of violent activity at the scene, leaving the entire operation in a prolonged state of tension, where every small clue was carefully weighed, but none was sufficient to provide a clear explanation for her disappearance. After many days of continuous searching without any additional decisive clues, the search and rescue commanders, along with representatives from local law enforcement agencies, conducted an overall assessment of the scene based on all the data collected from Antelope Canyon and the surrounding area, and a common conclusion gradually took shape. There was not enough evidence to classify this as a criminal case. The scene reports emphasized the complete absence of signs typically associated with criminal activity, including bloodstains, signs of struggle, destroyed belongings, or any proof indicating direct intervention by another person at the time. Laura Whitman disappeared. The personal items found scattered did not form a clear logical sequence of violence or pursuit, but instead aligned more closely with the scenario of someone becoming disoriented in complex terrain and possibly leaving the main tour route in a state of panic or exhaustion. Based on the natural characteristics of Antelope Canyon, where narrow slots, interwoven side passages, and many hazardous areas are difficult to observe with the naked eye, the official hypothesis put forward was that Laura may have suffered a natural accident, such as slipping into a deep rock crevice, becoming trapped in an inaccessible location, or wandering out of the controlled area and succumbing to the harsh desert environment. The fact that no body or direct evidence was found was not seen as contradicting this hypothesis, because terrain experts pointed out that many areas within the canyon and the adjacent desert can completely conceal traces of a human for extended periods, especially as weather and geological conditions change. On that basis, the authorities decided not to open a formal criminal investigation, meaning no criminal pursuit procedures were activated, no suspect files were created, and no resources were allocated for investigative activities beyond the standard scope of search and rescue operations. This decision, though presented as a step based on the available evidence, sparked many mixed emotions within Laura's family, who continued to believe that her disappearance could not be explained solely by a simple accident in a tightly controlled area. Over time, as additional search efforts yielded no new results, and all lines of hypothesis reached dead ends, Laura Whitman's case was reclassified to presumed deceased, an administrative category, reflecting the assessment that the likelihood of survival after such a long period in harsh conditions was extremely low. This classification did not come with a specific explanation of death, but in practice it effectively closed most active search operations, leaving only periodic, largely formal sweeps when new information emerged, which rarely did. The media, which had given the disappearance significant attention in the early days with images of the majestic canyon and questions about the safety of adventure tourism, gradually reduced coverage as no noteworthy developments occurred. News articles shifted from an urgent tone to one of retrospection, mentioning Laura as one of many mysterious disappearances at famous natural landmarks, and eventually, her name appeared only in statistical lists or compilation pieces about travel safety. For the authorities, the case entered a prolonged frozen state, where files were archived, physical evidence was sealed, and any future decisions depended entirely on whether a new clue strong enough to change the initial assessment ever surfaced. For Laura's family, this freeze held a very different meaning. It marked the shift from fragile hope to a state of indefinite waiting, where there were no clear answers but also no true closure. In the years that followed, as Antelope Canyon continued to welcome thousands of tourists each season, and the story of Laura Whitman faded from public memory, her case remained like a cold file in storage, considered closed procedurally, but still open in terms of truth, waiting for something sufficiently extraordinary to break the long silence. Nearly 4 years after Laura Whitman's file was placed into a frozen status, and her name gradually faded from public memory, an entirely unrelated event, at least on the surface, shook the entire story back to life on a cold early spring morning near the southern forest edge area of Flagstaff, Arizona, where a trail maintenance worker discovered a woman collapsed at the side of a dirt road leading into the semi-wilderness zone. The woman appeared barely able to stand on her own, her body so gaunt that her shoulder blades and ribs were clearly visible through the dirty and faded shirt, her skin a sickly gray, lips cracked and dry, hair matted with dust and hardened dried sweat. When questioned, she could not form complete sentences, only producing fragmented sounds and sluggish reflexes, indicating severe dehydration and prolonged exhaustion. The maintenance worker immediately called for emergency services, and while waiting for the medical team, he tried to keep the woman conscious, but realized she carried no identification, phone or personal items that could help establish her identity. The ambulance crew arrived on scene in under 20 minutes, quickly assessing her vital signs as critically endangered, abnormally low blood pressure, weak and irregular pulse, along with clear signs of chronic malnutrition, showing this was not the result of a short-term incident, but the outcome of a process lasting months, even years. The woman was secured to a stretcher, given emergency IV fluids right in the ambulance, and transported directly to the nearest hospital in Flagstaff in a semi-comatose state, where emergency doctors prioritized stabilizing her vital functions before any deeper evaluation could proceed. In the initial intake record, she was listed as Jane Doe since she could not provide a name, date of birth, or any identifying information, and her clinical condition made interviewing her nearly impossible in those first hours. Doctors noted that beyond physical emaciation, the woman displayed signs of cognitive impairment, including spatial disorientation, slow responses to light and sound, and unexplained mild tremors, prompting them to consider possible neurological damage from prolonged malnutrition and stress. Once her condition stabilized somewhat after nearly 2 days of intensive treatment, the hospital began the standard identification process for unidentified individuals, including photographs, fingerprint collection, and cross-checking against federal and state databases for missing persons and criminal records. At first, the process yielded no immediate results, as several years had passed since Laura Whitman disappeared, and her file had been moved to rarely accessed archive status. However, When the system automatically expanded the search to include cases classified as presumed deceased, a matching result began to emerge with increasing probability through each successive comparison. The fingerprints taken from the woman at Flagstaff Hospital matched a dataset stored in a missing persons file from Arizona 4 years earlier, related to a tourist who vanished during a tour of Antelope Canyon. This match was initially flagged for further verification due to the long time lapse and the dramatic change in appearance, but when biometrics experts closely examined the features that do not change over time, the final conclusion became undeniable. The nameless woman found in that state of extreme exhaustion was Laura Whitman. This information was relayed to hospital administration, then to local law enforcement, and ultimately confirmed officially through the necessary legal procedures. For those who had participated in the original search campaign at Antelope Canyon, the news spread like a shock, as it directly challenged the natural accident hypothesis that had been accepted for years. Laura Whitman, once considered deceased in administrative records, was now not only alive, but had reappeared in a condition indicating she had endured something far beyond any scenario previously considered. Laura's family received the call from the hospital in a state of disbelief, informed that their daughter was still alive and receiving treatment in Flagstaff, a revelation that completely reversed 4 years of vague and painful waiting. Meanwhile, doctors continued to focus on keeping Laura stable, limiting any stimuli that could cause additional psychological stress, and postponing questions about her past until she was strong enough to communicate. The confirmation of her identity not only closed the chapter of an unidentified woman being saved, but also opened a new reality, where a disappearance once thought concluded abruptly returned with consequences no one had prepared for, shifting the question from whether Laura Whitman was still alive to what had happened during the 4 years the world believed she had vanished forever. After Laura Whitman's identity was confirmed, and her immediate vital signs were no longer at critical levels, the hospital in Flagstaff initiated a comprehensive medical evaluation process involving multiple specialties to reconstruct what her body had endured during the 4 years she was missing, and the results quickly showed this was not the consequence of a short-term incident or a period of free-roaming survival. Detailed blood tests revealed that Laura suffered from severe chronic malnutrition, with persistently low levels of total protein, albin, iron, zinc, and many essential vitamins, reflecting a severely and continuously deficient diet, rather than the intermittent starvation episodes typically seen in people lost in the wilderness. Internal medicine doctors noted that this malnutrition pattern was consistent with long-term controlled access to food, where calorie and micronutrient intake was maintained at just enough to sustain life, but insufficient to preserve physical condition. In parallel, rehabilitation specialists documented widespread muscle atrophy, particularly in the muscle groups responsible for standing, walking, and balance, with a degree of strength loss disproportionate to Laura's age and pre-disappearance health history. Measurements of muscle mass and motor function assessment indicated she had undergone a prolonged period of restricted movement, where the body was not used adequately over many years, leading to gradual degeneration of muscle tissue and bone load-bearing capacity. Full-body X-rays and CT scans provided further critical evidence by revealing multiple old healed bone injuries aligned incorrectly, including small fractures and cracks in the ribs, wrists, and lower legs, with abnormal callus formation due to improper alignment or fixation. These injuries indicated Laura had experienced repeated trauma severe enough to cause bone breaks, but without access to specialized medical care, forcing the body to heal on its own under suboptimal conditions, and leaving long-term consequences of chronic pain and mobility limitation. Beyond the musculoskeletal injuries, dermatologists and endocrinologists noted clear signs of prolonged lack of natural light exposure, including abnormally pale skin, reduced pigmentation, severe vitamin D deficiency manifestations, and calcium metabolism disorders, factors that typically only appear when a person lives in an enclosed environment with little to no sunlight exposure for a very extended period. Ophthalmologists also recorded extreme light sensitivity in the eyes, along with sluggish pupillary reflexes, indicating Laura's visual system had adapted to low light conditions for a significant time, a feature inconsistent with scenarios of outdoor living or free movement in urban environments. When all the clinical data were synthesized from chronic malnutrition, prolonged immobility-induced muscle atrophy, misaligned healed bone injuries, to physiological signs of light deprivation, the medical board concluded that Laura Whitman's condition could not reasonably be explained by the hypothesis that she had lived freely for 4 years, whether in the wilderness or within a community. People who are homeless or self-isolated typically still maintain some level of physical activity, exposure to sunlight, and a completely different pattern of injuries from what was observed in Laura. Instead, the entire medical picture aligned far more consistently with a scenario of long-term confinement under tightly controlled conditions, where living space was restricted, food and water intake was regulated, mobility was limited, and exposure to natural light was almost entirely eliminated. This conclusion was not based on speculation or subjective accounts, but formed through consensus among multiple specialties, grounded in specific medical evidence, and it marked a pivotal turning point in how the case was viewed, as for the first time, from a scientific and clinical perspective, Laura Whitman's condition was identified as the direct result of a prolonged systematic process of captivity that left deep and lasting damage to her body. In parallel with the medical evaluation process, a team of psychology and psychiatry experts was assigned to assess Laura Whitman's mental state under tightly controlled conditions to avoid reactivating trauma, and right from the initial sessions, signs of severe psychological disorder became evident in a clear and consistent manner. The doctors noted that Laura met all the diagnostic criteria for severe post-traumatic stress disorder, with manifestations including hypervigilance, strong startle responses to unexpected sounds, severe sleep disturbances, and recurring nightmares that did not follow any specific chronological order. When asked to describe the 4 years that had passed, Laura was unable to establish timelines in a linear way, frequently confusing day and night, seasons of the year, and tending to use vague concepts like a very long time ago, or so long, instead of specific figures, indicating the loss of time perception commonly seen in individuals subjected to prolonged isolation in environments lacking natural cues for orientation. The experts determined that this disruption was not a sign of fabrication or intentional avoidance, but a psychological consequence of living in conditions deprived of elements that help the brain maintain a sense of time flow, such as sunlight, normal daily routines, and social interaction. One of the most prominent reactions recorded was a clear state of panic when Laura had to be in enclosed spaces, or when the therapy room door was closed, even briefly. In such situations, her heart rate spiked, breathing became rapid, hands trembled uncontrollably, and she tended to seek an immediate escape route, forcing the doctors to adjust the therapy environment to be open, with wide views and the door always unlocked. This reaction was assessed as consistent with individuals who have experienced prolonged confinement in restricted spaces, where the feeling of being trapped becomes a powerful and almost uncontrollable trigger. When the experts carefully introduced suggestions related to tourist sites or natural scenery, similar to Antelope Canyon, Laura displayed clear avoidance tendencies, changing the subject, prolonged silence, or signs of acute stress, indicating that memories connected to the period before her disappearance remained tied to trauma and could not yet be approached safely. Notably, throughout the evaluation process, Laura showed no signs of embellishing stories or adjusting statements to impress or seek attention, a factor that experts pay particular attention to in cases with potential legal implications. Her emotional responses occurred spontaneously, sometimes disproportionate to the current context, but consistent with documented trauma patterns in medical literature, and when unable to answer a question, she tended to acknowledge the vagueness, or say she did not remember, rather than trying to fill gaps with uncertain details. The psychologists also observed subtle signs of prolonged psychological control, manifested in the way Laura excessively self-regulated her behavior, asking permission for simple actions, or appearing anxious when making personal choices, as if she had become accustomed to all decisions being made by someone else. She frequently asked whether her answers were correct, and tended to watch the interlocutor's reactions to adjust her words, a behavior commonly seen in victims who lived in monitored environments or faced punishment for not following implicit rules. Upon deeper evaluation using standardized tools, Laura exhibited high baseline anxiety, irrational guilt, and a tendency to self-blame, characteristics that often develop in individuals subjected to long-term psychological manipulation, where the victim gradually accepts imposed norms and loses their sense of personal autonomy. More importantly, there were no indications that Laura was deliberately fabricating, exaggerating experiences, or constructing a cohesive narrative for external purposes, as the memory fragments she expressed remained disjointed, sometimes conflicting on minor details, but consistent in emotion and physiological response. For the experts, this very lack of polish and fragmented nature actually reinforced the reliability of the assessment, because fabricated stories tend to be more coherent and arranged in an easily understandable sequence, whereas Laura's account reflected a mind still struggling to process experiences beyond ordinary endurance capacity. The psychological conclusion, reached with high consensus among the experts, was that Laura Whitman was suffering from severe PTSD, accompanied by disorders related to prolonged isolation and psychological control, and these manifestations not only aligned with the prior medical findings, but also provided an independent layer of evidence, indicating that her experience during the 4 missing years was not a series of random events, but a prolonged traumatic process that left deep and complex imprints on her psychological structure. When Laura Whitman's physical and psychological condition had stabilized enough for limited contact with authorities, investigators proceeded to take her initial statement in a specially designed environment to minimize pressure, with short duration, non-interrogative in nature, and always under the supervision of a psychology expert. However, right from the start, the structure of Laura's statement showed clear fragmentation and non-linearity, not following the conventional chronological sequence that investigators are accustomed to. Instead of recounting the story from the time of her disappearance to when she was found, Laura presented disjointed fragments of memory that emerged more as sensations than events, where smells, sounds, and bodily states took center stage rather than specific dates or locations. When asked how long she had been held captive, Laura could not provide a number or estimated time frame, not even distinguishing that 4 years had passed, but only repeated that the time was very long and never-ending, a response consistent with the prior psychological assessments of time perception loss due to prolonged isolation. She could not identify markers such as seasons, years, or external events, and attempts to anchor her memories to familiar points like holidays or major news yielded no results, as Laura admitted she had no contact whatsoever with outside information to serve as reference points. Instead, her statement focused on recurring sensory details, such as the heavy musty smell of a long unventilated enclosed space, a metallic odor mixed with an unnameable cleaning agent, or the steady sound of an engine or machinery operating in cycles, appearing and disappearing in a rhythm she gradually became familiar with. Laura described how these sounds became the only way she could measure the passage of time, even without knowing whether it was hours, days, or weeks, and that small changes in the sound, such as it going silent for an extended period, often sent her into a state of panic because she did not know what was about to happen. She also spoke of an imposed daily cycle, where light and darkness did not follow natural patterns but appeared and vanished artificially, forcing her body to adapt to an unstable rhythm of eating, sleeping, and resting according to external signals rather than her own biological sense. When investigators tried to elicit information about the location of her confinement, Laura appeared confused and frustrated with herself for being unable to provide any specific description of the place, unable to recall windows, sunlight direction, or familiar geographical features, and could only say that the space was underground, or very enclosed, descriptions that were more perceptual than definitive. She could not clearly state how she had been taken there, how far the journey was, or whether it passed through populated areas, because according to her, the transition moments were often accompanied by extreme fatigue, panic, or sensory obstruction, making memories of the movement almost completely erased. For the investigators, This statement was clearly not yet sufficient to serve as direct evidence in any legal proceedings, as it lacked core elements, such as time, place, identities of involved parties, and sequence of events, and many details could not be independently verified at the present time. However, rather than viewing this as an obstacle, the investigative team assessed Laura's statement from a different angle, treating it as an initial sensory map that provided indirect clues about the conditions of confinement, the surrounding environment, and recurring elements that could potentially be cross-referenced with physical data or other records in the future. The experts determined that the fragmented and incoherent nature of the statement did not diminish its reliability. On the contrary, it aligned with the prior psychological assessments of severe trauma and memories being stored in sensory form, rather than as narratives, especially in victims subjected to long-term captivity and control. Laura did not attempt to fill gaps with speculation or uncertain details, frequently pausing to say she did not remember or did not know, a behavior regarded by experts as a sign of honesty in the context of trauma. Therefore, although the initial statement could not yet serve as a solid legal foundation, it was identified as an important starting point for the entire subsequent investigative process, not as a complete narrative, but as a collection of initial signals that needed to be analyzed, cross-referenced, and expanded through other investigative methods, with the goal of gradually transforming the disjointed sensations Laura carried into traceable facts. Based on Laura Whitman's entire initial statement, the medical and psychological evaluation results, along with the detailed search records archived from the time of her disappearance, the investigative team reanalyzed the initial approach at Antelope Canyon, with a focus on the brief moment when Laura separated from the group, viewing it as the pivotal point that determined the entire subsequent course of events. Investigators reviewed every meter of the official tour route within the canyon, using three-dimensional terrain maps, old scene photographs, the guide's GPS data, and statements from fellow tour participants to reconstruct the movement flow on that day, from the moment the group entered the slot canyon until the end at the final gathering point. This analysis revealed that Antelope Canyon, despite being tightly managed, still contained secluded sections where visibility was severely limited, sounds were absorbed by the high rock walls, and the flow of people was forced to move slowly or pause temporarily, creating short gaps sufficient for one individual to approach another without attracting attention. The investigative team identified several feasible approach positions where someone standing behind or beside Laura could engage in private conversation for a few dozen seconds without drawing the attention of those around, especially in the context of a tour group accustomed to stopping to listen to the guide's explanations or waiting for the group ahead to move forward. The fact that Laura left no signs of struggle or panic at the scene was viewed as indirect evidence that the perpetrator, if one existed, did not employ violence from the outset, because any coercive act in such a confined, crowded space would almost certainly have been noticed. Instead, investigators believed Laura most likely left the main route in a relatively calm state, possibly believing she was following reasonable instructions or receiving necessary assistance in a minor situation. Behavioral analysis indicated that the perpetrator had exploited a common psychological principle in tourist environments, where visitors tend to trust people who appear familiar with the location or position themselves in a helping role, especially when in an unfamiliar space reliant on external information. The investigative team considered the possibility that the person who approached Laura had taken advantage of an unofficial support role, such as claiming to be familiar with the canyon, an assistant for the tour company, or simply an experienced-looking tourist, to offer seemingly reasonable directions, like pointing out a safer side passage, a less crowded waiting spot, or offering help when Laura lagged behind for personal reasons. These roles did not need official confirmation, because in the practical context of a crowded tourist site, the boundary between staff, affiliates, and visitors often blurs in the eyes of outsiders, creating conditions for impersonation without immediate suspicion. Investigators also analyzed the timing factor, noting that the moment Laura separated from the group occurred just as the people ahead moved through a narrow bend, completely blocking visibility for a few seconds, enough time for someone else to approach and lead her off the main route without leaving clear traces. The ability to go unnoticed in a busy tourist area was seen as a key factor, indicating that this behavior had been carefully calculated to blend into the normal flow of the group rather than create an unusual event that would be easily remembered. The investigative team also hypothesized that the perpetrator may have had a high level of familiarity with the canyon, understanding the blind spots in visibility, lesser-noticed side slots, and areas where someone could wait briefly without being detected, knowledge far exceeding that of a first-time tourist. When synthesizing the above elements, from the choice of approach location, the non-violent method, the exploitation of trust and unofficial support roles, to the utilization of Antelope Canyon's specific spatial structure, the investigative team concluded that Laura Whitman's disappearance from the very beginning bore the hallmarks of deliberate action. This was not a random accident or an impulsive decision by the victim, but the result of an approach designed to appear as a normal interaction in a tourist environment, thereby clearly establishing that the case involved criminal elements from the very first moment, even though those elements had been completely concealed beneath the orderly and safe appearance of an official guided tour. After the behavioral analyses indicated that Laura Whitman's disappearance bore the hallmarks of deliberate criminal activity, the investigative team decided to shift focus to environmental forensics in order to seek objective evidence independent of the victim's fragmented memory, with the goal of identifying the environment Laura had been exposed to during her long period of captivity. Immediately upon Laura's medical intake, forensic experts systematically collected samples of soil, sandstone dust, and microorganisms adhering to her skin, hair, fingernails, clothing, and footwear, all performed under strict sterile conditions to ensure the samples accurately reflected long-term environmental exposure rather than cross-contamination during rescue efforts. These samples were meticulously separated by particle size, mineral composition, organic traces, and microbial strains, then sent to specialized laboratories in forensic geology and environmental biology for independent analysis. In parallel, the investigative team requested control samples from Antelope Canyon, including baseline soil, characteristic Navajo sandstone powder, fine sediments accumulated in the slot crevices, along with the microbial system adapted to the narrow, humid, water-eroded slot environment. When these samples were compared to the material recovered from Laura's body, analysts quickly observed clear and systematic differences, as the samples from Laura did not exhibit the typical mineral characteristics of Navajo sandstone that overwhelmingly dominate Antelope Canyon. Instead, they contained a high proportion of sedimentary minerals mixed with limestone and weathering traces, characteristic of a cold, dry highland environment, along with angular sandstone particles, showing minimal impact from natural water flow. This result allowed experts to completely rule out the hypothesis that Laura had been held or lived for an extended period in Antelope Canyon, or geologically similar areas in northern Arizona, because if that had been the case, the environmental traces on her body would have displayed entirely different mineral characteristics. Microbiological analysis further reinforced this conclusion, as the samples from Laura showed the presence of bacterial strains and fungal spores that typically thrive in enclosed temperature and humidity-stable environments, rarely found in open spaces exposed to direct sunlight and significant climatic fluctuations, like the canyon. When the comparison scope was expanded to adjacent geological regions, the investigative team utilized federal geological databases and microbial distribution maps to cross-reference matching features, and a band of territory began to emerge with a high degree of similarity, stretching from northern Arizona into southern Utah. Experts pointed out that this area features a transitional geological structure where ancient sediments, limestone, and sandstone intermingle, along with dry but stable climatic conditions that produce a distinctive microbial system, often found in enclosed, semi-subterranean structures or buildings with minimal natural light exposure. Even more notably, some mineral particles adhering to Laura showed signs of long-term accumulation, with degrees of abrasion and distribution, indicating they were not the result of brief, one-time contact, but reflected repeated exposure to the same type of environment over an extended period. This aligned with the medical assessments of Laura's restricted mobility and life in a relatively fixed space, while simultaneously ruling out the possibility that she had been moved through multiple different locations throughout the 4 years she was missing. When synthesizing all the environmental forensic data, from minerals and sandstone dust to the microbial system, the investigative team concluded that Antelope Canyon was not the place where Laura was held, but merely the starting point of the incident, and that the actual confinement environment was most likely located within the Arizona-Utah geographic band, with environmental characteristics matching the recovered traces. On that basis, a strategic decision was made to redirect the geographic investigation, narrowing the search scope from a vast area that once included many tourist sites and open deserts to a focused sweep of isolated locations within this transitional band, places with enclosed structures, low visibility, and suitability for long-term captivity, as indicated by the scientific evidence. This decision marked a clear shift in the investigation, from hypotheses based on initial inferences to an approach driven by specific physical data, laying the foundation for subsequent steps aimed at precisely identifying the area and type of space where Laura Whitman had been held throughout her period of disappearance. From the environmental forensic conclusions, showing that Laura Whitman did not live in outdoor conditions and did not move continuously through multiple different environments, the investigative team proceeded to delineate the confinement space by completely ruling out the possibility that she had been held in a wilderness setting, as both medical and biological indicators contradicted long-term survival outdoors, in forests, deserts, or open rocky mountain areas. Experts noted that if Laura had lived in wilderness conditions, her body would exhibit very different characteristics, including darkened skin from prolonged sun exposure, specific skin lesions from insects and plants, thick calluses on the soles of her feet, along with microbial samples reflecting a highly variable open environment, none of which appeared in the collected analysis results. Ruling out the wilderness environment allowed the investigation to focus on isolated man-made structures capable of maintaining an enclosed space with limited light, controlled movement, and human isolation over a long period without frequent relocation. The investigative team identified types of structures potentially fitting this model, including seasonally underused vacation cabins, agricultural storage sheds, or supply warehouses located outside residential areas, long-built but incompletely registered houses, along with accessory structures on large private land holdings in the border region between Arizona and Utah. The screening process was implemented by combining multiple administrative and spatial data sources, in which federal and state land records were cross-referenced with property tax data to identify parcels with existing structures, but unusually low or stagnant tax values over many years, a sign of limited use and infrequent inspection. Investigators also reviewed structures lacking clear postal addresses, without connections to standard public electricity, water or utility services, as these factors often indicate a high degree of isolation and potential for discrete long-term operation. In parallel, satellite imagery and aerial photographs were used to identify structures showing signs of stable existence, but minimal entry/exit activity, such as infrequent vehicle presence, no evidence of regular renovation or maintenance, and no significant seasonal changes. The investigative team also analyzed land ownership records to identify individuals or entities owning multiple small properties, particularly scattered accessory structures, far from main residential areas, as this ownership pattern allows one person to maintain private spaces with little attention drawn. Areas with low population density, limited road access, and low traffic volume were prioritized for the screening list, because such locations facilitate hiding activities for years without attracting notice from neighbors or local authorities. Seasonally used hunting cabins, abandoned post-harvest agricultural storage sheds, or houses deeply situated on large private land were assessed as having high compatibility, especially if located near secondary dirt roads, allowing discreet access. Once the data were compiled, the investigative team compiled an initial list of hundreds of potential sites, then proceeded to filter based on specific criteria such as the ability to control natural light, the degree of sound insulation in the structure, sufficient small size to restrict movement, yet large enough to sustain minimal living, and evidence of long-term enclosed space existence. Sites that failed to meet these criteria were quickly eliminated, while structures matching multiple factors simultaneously were retained for deeper evaluation. The delineation process also accounted for the practical reality that long-term confinement requires stability, access to minimal supplies, and a high degree of privacy, conditions difficult to achieve in populated areas or near tourist sites. Therefore, sites located deep in rural highland or underdeveloped border regions were prioritized for consideration. Through multiple rounds of review and elimination, the list of suspect locations was gradually narrowed from a broad range down to a limited set of structures that fully met the criteria for environment, construction, and degree of isolation, consistently reflecting the long-term captivity model inferred from the medical, psychological, and environmental forensic evidence related to Laura Whitman's case. From the list of suspect locations that had been delineated after cross-referencing land records, tax data, and degree of isolation, a cabin located deep within Kane County, Utah, emerged as an outlier with a high density of matches to all the investigative assumptions established earlier. The structure sits on a large parcel of rugged terrain, far from main roads and completely isolated from residential clusters, not within any tourist area, nor along popular hunting or camping routes. The only access is a small, narrow dirt road that has eroded over time, showing no signs of regular maintenance and virtually no record of frequent vehicle traffic, indicating the area is rarely visited in normal activity. Administrative records show the cabin is not registered as a primary residence, has no history of stable connection to the electrical grid, domestic water supply, or garbage collection services, and does not appear in land use reports for agricultural or recreational purposes, creating a significant gap regarding the actual functional use of the structure over many years. When investigators approached the cabin following proper procedure, the initial visual impression was of an old, poorly maintained building with faded wooden surfaces, a low roof, small windows carefully covered, giving a sense of enclosure and separation. There were no signs of ordinary habitation such as personal vehicles, outdoor items, household trash bins, or fresh footprints around the area, making the cabin appear at first glance like an abandoned structure. However, as soon as a more detailed inspection was conducted within the permitted scope, investigators quickly realized that this emptiness was more of a disguise than neglect. Inside the cabin, the space was organized in a minimalist and harsh manner, with functional areas reduced to the bare minimum, natural light virtually non-existent due to small, tightly covered windows, while the low ceiling created a feeling of compression and disorientation. Certain floor and wall surfaces showed concentrated wear in specific spots rather than widespread distribution, indicating prolonged human presence within a very limited spatial range, rather than free movement throughout the entire cabin. The household items found were all geared toward basic survival maintenance, completely lacking any signs of personalization, reflecting no choices or preferences of the user, but rather deliberate arrangement aimed at controlling daily routines. There were no books, entertainment devices, decorations, or any indication that this had ever been a voluntary living space or vacation spot. On the contrary, the spatial layout evoked an environment designed to restrict behavior, minimize stimulation, and maintain complete dependence on the controller. Investigators also noted that the cabin structure significantly dampened external sounds, while small internal noises echoed clearly and repeatedly, creating a monotonous, enclosed auditory environment, consistent with the sensory descriptions Laura Whitman provided in her initial statement: regular hard-to-source sounds, and the absence of natural cues to distinguish day from night. Certain areas inside the cabin showed signs of prolonged movement restriction, including fixed points where contact surfaces were worn disproportionately to the overall space size, suggesting a person may have been forced to remain in a very narrow posture or range for an extended time. At the same time, investigators found no evidence that anyone inside could leave freely, as all entry and exit points were designed or modified to be easily controlled from the outside, with door structures, locks and spacing that did not allow flexible movement without external intervention. The absence of signs of voluntary habitation was further reinforced by the complete lack of items for long-term needs such as varied clothing, personal belongings, or modifications aimed at improving living comfort. Every element present in the cabin pointed to a pattern of forced, prolonged and highly controlled living, consistent with the prior medical and psychological conclusions about Laura's physical and mental condition. When synthesizing the on-site observations with the existing investigative data, the team quickly determined that this cabin could not be regarded as a harmless abandoned structure, but as a location highly likely to have been used for unlawful long-term confinement. Given the severity of the discovered indicators, the scene was immediately secured according to legal procedure to preserve all physical traces, prevent uncontrolled entry, and ensure the integrity of potential evidence. A control perimeter was established around the cabin area, while investigators documented the current state through photographs, detailed diagrams, and appropriate preservation measures. At the same time, an official crime scene examination file was opened, marking the transition of the site status from suspect to a scene requiring comprehensive analysis, with the objective of clearly determining the nature of the cabin's use, the duration of the forced habitation signs, and the direct connection between this space and Laura Whitman's prolonged disappearance. After the cabin scene in Kane County, Utah was secured and transitioned to official examination status, specialized teams conducted detailed analysis of every structural and physical element of the space to clearly identify the actual functional use of the structure over a long period. The first focus was placed on the door system, locks and entry/exit points, as these are the decisive factors in determining any occupant's ability to move freely. Investigators noted that the cabin had only one main entry/exit, with a thick wooden door, reinforced hinges from the outside, and a locking system not in line with standard residential norms. The lock was positioned for easy operation from the outside but posed significant difficulty for anyone inside attempting to open it without a key or tool. More notably, certain interior architectural details revealed the presence of fake exits, including small doors or wall recesses shaped like escape routes but actually leading to sealed or completely blocked spaces, creating an illusion of escape options while in reality offering no possibility of leaving. These structures were assessed as having a strong psychological impact, particularly in the context of long-term captivity, where the victim could be kept in a state of false hope and dependence on the controller. In parallel with analyzing the lock and exit systems, investigators evaluated the degree of light and sound restriction inside the cabin. The small, high-placed windows heavily covered with thick material made natural light penetration virtually impossible, leading to complete dependence on artificial light sources controlled from outside or on a fixed cycle. The interior space absorbed and dampened external environmental sounds, while internal noises such as footsteps, small movements, or light impacts echoed clearly and repeatedly, creating a monotonous auditory environment prone to disrupting perception of time and space. Experts determined that the combination of absent natural light and controlled sound is a typical feature of confinement spaces designed to weaken orientation ability and disrupt normal biological rhythms. Next, the inventory and analysis of household items was conducted systematically. Everything found in the cabin was minimal and functional, sufficient only to sustain basic life, including simple eating utensils, a few non-chosen personal items, and crude devices lacking any entertainment or intellectual stimulation capability. There was no sign of accumulation of items over time, no change in type or quality of objects, indicating the user had no decision-making power over their living environment. The arrangement of these items also showed tight control, with fixed positions, limited mobility, and no allowance for spatial customization. When cross-referencing the on-site findings with Laura Whitman's medical records, experts quickly observed significant correlations: the muscle atrophy, chronic malnutrition, and misaligned healed bone injuries, documented during medical evaluation aligned with an environment of restricted movement, lack of light, and inadequate nutrition over a long period. The prolonged absence of natural light also explained the abnormal physiological signs related to disrupted biological cycles and vitamin deficiencies that had been recorded. These details ruled out the possibility that Laura lived freely in a wilderness setting or voluntarily secluded herself, as those conditions typically involve higher levels of physical activity and greater exposure to natural light. At the same time, Laura's psychological records were compared with the cabin's structure and features to assess compatibility. The severe PTSD manifestations, panic reactions to enclosed spaces, loss of time perception, and signs of prolonged psychological control could all be reasonably explained within the context of a confinement space designed for isolation, control, and dependency. In particular, the fact that Laura could not accurately describe the geographic location, but clearly remembered sensory elements such as smells, sounds, and daily cycles, indicated she had lived in an enclosed environment where sensory stimuli were limited and repetitive. Matching exactly what was documented at the cabin, psychologists noted that features like fake exits and the absence of natural cues are elements that can contribute to weakening resolve, reinforcing compliance, and causing the victim to gradually lose the ability to assess reality. When synthesizing all the data, from physical structure, household items, light and sound conditions, along with close cross-referencing of medical and psychological records, the investigative team reached a functional conclusion. The cabin in Kane County was not an ordinary residence, nor a harmless abandoned structure, but a space deliberately used for long-term human confinement. This confinement function was not only evident in physical restrictions, but also in the way the space was organized to profoundly affect the victim's perception and psychology, disturbingly consistent with the condition in which Laura Whitman was documented after her reappearance. After the confinement function of the cabin in Kane County was confirmed through on-site, medical, and psychological analyses, the investigative focus shifted entirely to identifying the individual directly responsible for that space. Land records showed that the cabin was legally owned by Mark Holloway, a middle-aged man who had held title to the parcel for many years without any form of co-ownership or long-term usage authorization granted to third parties. Tax documents and property registrations indicated that Holloway maintained absolute control over the cabin, yet he did not declare it as his primary residence, nor did he register it for business, rental, or tourist lodging purposes, creating a prolonged legal gray area regarding the structure's true functional existence. This situation caused the cabin to fall into a near-invisible status within the civil management system, which investigators assessed as highly advantageous for prolonged unlawful activities without oversight. A deeper review of Mark Holloway's personal background revealed a clear pattern of reclusive and socially isolated living. Holloway maintained no stable family relationships, did not participate in community activities at his place of residence, and frequently moved between remote areas in Arizona and Utah. His employment history was fragmented, consisting mainly of seasonal short-term jobs with minimal legal obligations, allowing him flexibility in time and location without creating clear traces of routine activity. When investigators collected statements from individuals who had personal relationships or long-term contact with Holloway, a consistent series of observations began to form, describing him as someone with a strong controlling tendency, obsessed with order, silence, and compliance. Some individuals who had lived or worked near Holloway reported that he frequently imposed rigid rules on daily routines, restricted communication, and displayed clear discomfort when others showed independence or deviated from the patterns he enforced. Although these behaviors had never previously led to criminal charges, they reflected a psychological tendency consistent with establishing and maintaining long-term control over another person. In parallel with the personal background analysis, the investigative team traced Holloway's connections to the Antelope Canyon area where Laura Whitman disappeared. Data from operating permits, witness statements, and service records showed that Holloway had appeared in the area in an unofficial support role during several peak tourist periods. He was not a licensed official guide, but he had participated in auxiliary activities, such as coordinating small groups, providing logistical support, or directing visitors to paths through personal connections with certain local service providers. This ambiguous role allowed Holloway to access tourists without drawing the attention of regulatory agencies or security forces, while simultaneously projecting an outward image of helpfulness and reliability. Investigators assessed this as an ideal condition for approaching potential victims in a crowded environment without initially resorting to violence. When cross-referencing Holloway's travel schedule with the time of Laura Whitman's disappearance, several notable gaps appeared in his activity records, particularly on days when he was confirmed to be near Antelope Canyon but had no recorded official work or transactions. These gaps aligned with the time frame during which Laura separated from the tour group and vanished, reinforcing the hypothesis that Holloway had a realistic opportunity to approach and lead the victim away from the concentrated area without attracting notice. Analysis of the cabin also revealed that the preparations for a confinement space were not impulsive or improvised after the fact, but the result of a deliberate and prolonged preparatory process. Modifications to the locking structures, fake exits, light and sound restriction systems, along with the arrangement of minimal household items, required an investment of time, effort, and a certain understanding of the psychological impact of space on a person. Building material receipts, equipment and tools traced from local stores showed that Holloway had purchased items consistent with the changes discovered at the cabin, even though he never registered any renovations as required. This indicated that he not only held physical control over the structure, but also actively shaped the space for a specific function. When synthesizing ownership of the cabin, a personal history showing controlling tendencies, real connections to the Antelope Canyon tourist area, time gaps matching Laura Whitman's disappearance, and signs of long-term confinement space preparation, the investigative team determined that Mark Holloway fully met the criteria of a primary suspect. The decision to place Holloway under criminal investigation was not based on isolated speculation, but on a chain of logical analysis, in which individual elements might not carry sufficient weight alone, but when combined formed a consistent picture of behavior and opportunity. Identifying a specific suspect marked a major turning point in the case, as the focus shifted away from whether criminal activity had occurred, and toward the question of who had established, maintained and bore responsibility for the entire prolonged confinement process. With Mark Holloway emerging as the central figure in that chain of responsibility within the scope of the criminal investigation. From the identification of Mark Holloway as the primary suspect, the investigative team conducted an in-depth analysis of motive and method to explain how the prolonged confinement behavior could have continued for years without detection, while also assessing the degree of fit between that behavior and the established personal profile. The first focus was on the motive of long-term control, considered the core element driving the entire chain of actions. Behavioral experts determined that Holloway was not seeking direct material gain, nor did he display impulsive sexual motives or overt violent tendencies. Instead, he showed a need for absolute possession and control over another human being within a space he himself created and directed. This need aligned with Holloway's history of controlling behavior in prior personal relationships, where he exhibited an obsession with order, compliance, and the ability to dictate the entire rhythm of another person's life. The choice of a solo tourist as the victim was assessed as a deliberate, calculated step, because this group typically has low temporary social connections, no accompanying person for direct supervision, and is easily separated from a group in a crowded environment without immediately raising an alarm. Laura Whitman, as an independent tourist participating in a guided tour, fit the ideal victim profile from the perpetrator's perspective, present in a public crowded space but lacking strong personal ties in the local area, making her disappearance initially explainable by natural accident hypotheses. The nonviolent approach method was viewed as the key factor that allowed Holloway to avoid attention from the outset. Rather than using direct coercion, the suspected perpetrator exploited an unofficial support role and the image of someone knowledgeable about the terrain to build trust, guiding the victim away from the concentrated area in a short time without triggering defensive reactions. Experts believe that avoiding initial violence not only reduced the risk of detection, but also weakened the victim's ability to recognize the danger in the early stages, thereby facilitating subsequent control. Once the victim had been separated from the safe environment and brought into an isolated space, the methods for maintaining long-term confinement truly took effect. The cabin in Kane County, with its locking structures, fake exits, light and sound restrictions, was seen as a direct physical tool supporting the control objective. Maintaining minimal living conditions, providing just enough for survival, but not enough to create a sense of autonomy or hope of escape, was assessed as a strategy to erode willpower over time. Psychologists noted that the monotony of sensory stimulation, combined with the disruption of biological rhythms through light and sound control, could cause the victim to gradually lose the ability to orient time, reduce resistance, and develop a state of dependency. This method did not require frequent violence, but relied on environmental control to sustain power, consistent with Holloway's behavioral profile as someone who avoids direct confrontation but exhibits long-term manipulative tendencies. Another important factor in the analysis was the ability to avoid social attention over an extended period. Holloway selected an isolated location, unregistered as a residence, unconnected to standard utility services, and outside community activity routes, minimizing the risk of detection by neighbors or authorities. At the same time, his reclusive lifestyle and fragmented movements ensured that his absence or presence did not create noticeable changes in the community. The lack of boasting, sharing, or overt abnormal behavioral signs helped the perpetrator maintain a cover for many years. Investigators also noted that the absence of severe injuries or clear violent events at the public scene caused the initial disappearance to be classified as a natural accident, thereby reducing criminal investigative pressure in the early stages and indirectly prolonging the crime period. When cross-referencing all the above elements with Mark Holloway's behavioral profile, the analysis team concluded that the motive and methods showed high consistency. The need for prolonged control explained the investment in preparing the confinement space. The selection of a solo tourist victim fit the risk reduction strategy, the nonviolent approach and maintenance of confinement, based on environmental control, aligned with the tendency to avoid direct confrontation, and the ability to evade social attention, reflected the suspect's reclusive, minimally connected lifestyle. This fit not only reinforced the hypothesis of Holloway's central role in the case, but also helped the investigative team better understand how a prolonged confinement behavior could exist for many years in modern society without detection. Through a sophisticated combination of psychological motive, target selection, and spatial control. Based on all the data collected from the cabin scene, medical records, psychological evaluations, and suspect behavioral analysis, the investigative team proceeded to reconstruct in detail the prolonged confinement process that Laura Whitman most likely endured throughout the 4 years she was missing, in order to logically and consistently explain the extreme physical emaciation, cognitive impairment, and profound dependency documented when she was found. The focus of this reconstruction began with the imposed daily cycle, in which every aspect of daily life was not determined by the victim. Times for eating, resting, waking, light exposure or movement all occurred according to a fixed rhythm controlled by the perpetrator, creating a monotonous and enclosed loop. This cycle was not intended for care or optimal health maintenance, but only to ensure minimal survival, enough for the victim to stay alive, but insufficient for recovery or the development of physical and mental capacity. The regular repetition of a stimulus-poor routine caused concepts of days, weeks, and months to gradually blur, weakening time perception and making it difficult for the victim to determine how long she had been held. In parallel, absolute control over information and movement was maintained. Laura had no access to any independent sources of information about the outside world, no knowledge of search efforts, no awareness of the passage of time, and no indication that her existence was still acknowledged by others. The cabin space, with its externally locked doors and fake exits, restricted all movement possibilities at the physical level, while the lack of information made assessing escape opportunities virtually impossible. Even during brief moments when the victim was permitted limited movement within a very narrow range, the absence of context and orientation rendered those movements meaningless for preparing an escape. This confinement process was also designed to gradually erode the victim's capacity to resist, not through continuous violence, but through prolonged physical and mental attrition. Long-term movement restriction led to muscle atrophy, reduced endurance, and chronic pain, leaving the body incapable of actions requiring strength, speed, or coordination. At the same time, prolonged fatigue and lack of stimulation diminished concentration, planning ability, and motivation to resist. Built on this foundation, prolonged psychological manipulation played a central role in sustaining control. Experts assessed that the perpetrator most likely employed a strategy of alternating between providing minimal necessities and controlled deprivation, creating a calculated state of instability in which the victim gradually learned to adjust behavior to avoid negative consequences. Over time, this adaptation could turn into dependency, as compliance became the only way to maintain a relatively stable state, even if that state was one of captivity. Along with psychological manipulation, complete social isolation completed the confinement process. Laura had no independent social interactions, no contact with anyone other than the perpetrator, and no opportunity to receive external validation of her worth or the surrounding reality. The total absence of social relationships gradually eroded personal identity, while the sense of the outside world became abstract and distant. In that context, any thoughts of calling for help or escaping were obstructed not only by physical barriers, but also by the diminishing belief that escape was feasible or meaningful. When synthesizing these elements, the investigative team concluded that Laura's failure to escape early could not be simply understood as passivity or lack of will, but as the direct consequence of a systematically designed confinement process intended to progressively eliminate resistance capacity. The tight integration of imposed daily cycles, control over information and movement, physical weakening, prolonged psychological manipulation, and complete social isolation created an environment in which escape was not only difficult in practical terms, but also nearly inconceivable in cognitive terms. This process logically and consistently explains why the captivity could continue for many years without any successful escape attempts, while also illuminating the severity and deliberate nature of the criminal behavior throughout the entire case. After the confinement process was systematically reconstructed, and all constituent elements of the criminal behavior had fully converged, the authorities applied for and executed an arrest warrant for Mark Holloway in accordance with legal procedure, with the primary focus on ensuring the safety of the victim, the community, and the integrity of evidence. The arrest was carried out at Holloway's temporary residence in the Arizona area, after investigators confirmed that he still maintained practical control over the cabin in Kane County and had the ability to interfere with or destroy evidence, if alerted in advance. The arrest proceeded in a controlled manner, with no recorded physical resistance, though Holloway displayed a closed-off demeanor, avoided direct answers, and requested legal representation from the very first minutes, consistent with the previously established profile of cautious and controlling behavior. In parallel with detaining the suspect, specialized teams were deployed simultaneously to collect, preserve, and seal physical evidence at the cabin as well as other related locations. Evidence collection focused on elements capable of proving prolonged confinement, including the locking system, fake exit structures, surfaces showing concentrated wear from restricted movement, minimal household items, and unregistered renovation traces. Each item was documented in detail regarding position, condition, and functional relationship to the confinement space to ensure reproducibility in court. Samples were collected under strict chain-of-custody protocols to prevent cross-contamination and preserve evidentiary value during prosecution. At the same time, digital data related to Holloway, including storage devices, communication means, and transaction records, were seized and analyzed to determine travel timelines, time gaps, and signs of preparation and maintenance of the confinement space. During this phase, cross-referencing medical evidence, played a pivotal role in strengthening the causal link between the cabin environment and Laura Whitman's physical condition. Forensic experts compared the documented signs of chronic malnutrition, muscle atrophy, misaligned healed bone injuries, and prolonged light deprivation with the physical conditions recorded at the cabin, thereby building a scientific chain of reasoning, showing these injuries were consistent with a long-term environment of restricted movement, light, and nutrition. The comparison went beyond general similarity to examine the degree, distribution, and nature of each injury in detail, ruling out alternative hypotheses such as free living in the wilderness or voluntary seclusion. In parallel, Laura's statement was carefully cross-referenced with physical evidence, not to demand absolute detail matching, but to confirm consistency in sensory experiences, daily cycles, and spatial characteristics. Her fragmented descriptions of smells, sounds, light, and restricted movement were placed alongside findings at the cabin, showing a significant level of correspondence between the victim's subjective experience and the objective data collected. Psychologists and investigators noted that the lack of continuity in Laura's statement did not undermine its evidentiary value. On the contrary, it aligned with the diagnosis of severe PTSD and the confirmed prolonged confinement process, thereby increasing the reliability of the statement in a legal context. During case consolidation, the prosecution and investigative teams worked closely to systematize all evidence into a coherent prosecutorial structure, placing each individual element within an overarching logical chain. The indictment file focused not only on the acts of kidnapping and unlawful confinement, but also clarified the prolonged, deliberate, and highly controlled nature of the behavior to fully reflect the gravity of the case. Land records, tax documents, cabin renovation history, Holloway's connections to the Antelope Canyon tourist area, and time gaps matching Laura's disappearance were integrated to prove opportunity, means, and motive. At the same time, expert evaluations from forensics, medicine, and psychology were incorporated as scientific supporting evidence to strengthen the link between the suspect, the scene, and the consequences to the victim. Once all evidence categories had been collected, cross-referenced, and systematized, the case was formally transferred to the legal phase, marking the conclusion of the field investigation and initial analysis stage. This decision reflected the authorities' confidence that the file had reached the necessary level of completeness and rigor to proceed with prosecution, while ensuring that all subsequent steps would be conducted within the framework of due process, where the collected evidence would undergo open and rigorous scrutiny according to legal standards. After the authorities completed the investigation file and transferred all documents to the prosecution, Mark Holloway was formally charged criminally with offenses related to kidnapping, prolonged unlawful confinement, violation of personal freedom, and causing serious, long-term harm to the victim's physical and mental health. The indictment emphasized that the alleged conduct was not an impulsive or isolated incident, but a prepared, continuously maintained process over many years, demonstrating a systematic level of control and clear awareness of the consequences. The trial was held in state court, with the participation of a jury, prosecution representatives, defense team, and numerous expert witnesses. During the proceedings, the prosecution presented the chain of evidence in logical sequence, beginning with establishing Holloway's ownership and practical control over the cabin in Kane County, followed by findings from the scene examination that clearly showed the space's confinement function. Photographs, diagrams, and analyses of the locking structures, fake exits, degree of light and sound restriction were introduced to prove that the cabin could not be considered an ordinary residence. The prosecution then presented medical evidence, including conclusions regarding chronic malnutrition, muscle atrophy, misaligned healed bone injuries, and physiological signs related to prolonged light deprivation, linking them directly to the forced living conditions documented at the scene. Medical experts were called to explain why these injuries were inconsistent with hypotheses of free living in the wilderness or voluntary seclusion, and could only have formed in the context of prolonged captivity and restricted movement. In parallel, Laura Whitman's psychological evaluation records were presented to clarify the severe PTSD manifestations, loss of time perception, panic reactions to enclosed spaces, and signs of prolonged psychological control. The prosecution emphasized that these manifestations aligned with the reconstructed confinement model, while also explaining why the victim's statement was fragmented and non-linear. When Laura was called to testify, her statement was delivered cautiously, focusing on sensory experiences, daily cycles, and feelings of being controlled, rather than requiring detailed descriptions of time or location, something psychological experts affirmed was not feasible in the context of prolonged trauma. The defense attempted to undermine the prosecution's arguments by stressing the absence of direct eyewitnesses to the kidnapping at Antelope Canyon and questioning the reliability of the victim's memories. However, these arguments were countered by the prosecution, which pointed out that the charge of prolonged unlawful confinement does not depend on proving an initial moment of coercion, but on a consistent chain of indirect evidence, including opportunity to approach the victim, control over the confinement space, traces of forced habitation, and undeniable medical and psychological consequences. Expert witnesses explained that fragmentation in the victim's memory is a typical consequence of severe PTSD and cannot be regarded as evidence of fabrication or dishonesty. In the closing arguments, the prosecution urged the jury to consider the case as a continuous chain of behavior, in which each piece of evidence reinforced the others, forming a complete picture of motive, method, and consequences. After deliberation, the jury returned a unanimous verdict finding Mark Holloway guilty on the main charges, recognizing that the prolonged confinement had caused serious harm and left lasting consequences for the victim. In the sentencing phase, the judge analyzed the aggravating factors, including the extended duration of the crime, the absolute level of control, and the victim's profound physical and mental deterioration, thereby imposing a life imprisonment sentence on Holloway, under the maximum penalty allowed by law. After the legal proceedings stabilized, Laura Whitman's current condition was assessed as a long-term, complex and non-linear recovery process, reflecting the profound depth of damage that 4 years of captivity had inflicted on both physical and mental levels. Medical and psychological therapy were implemented in parallel, with close coordination among rehabilitation physicians, nutrition specialists, clinical psychologists, and social support teams to build the minimal stable foundation for her daily life. On the medical side, Laura remains in a prolonged treatment phase to address the aftermath of chronic malnutrition, restore atrophied muscle mass, improve mobility, and manage old misaligned bone injuries that cause ongoing pain and functional limitation. This process requires careful intervention to avoid excessive physical stress that could cause re-injury, while continuously adjusting according to the realistic tolerance of a body weakened over an extended period. Alongside physical recovery, psychological therapy plays a central role in stabilizing Laura's life, focusing on addressing severe PTSD, restoring basic feelings of safety, and rebuilding a sense of personal control that had been stripped away during captivity. Experts note that this progression does not follow a straight line, but includes periods of improvement interspersed with symptom flare-ups, especially when Laura faces triggers related to enclosed spaces, repetitive sounds, or situations evoking feelings of control. In this context, Laura deliberately maintains limited social contact, as recommended by professionals, to minimize the risk of triggering panic responses or disorientation. She avoids crowded environments, does not participate in broad social activities, and keeps interactions within a very narrow circle, consisting of immediate family and treatment specialists, where interactions are predictable and kept at a safe level. The fact that she does not return to her previous life is accepted as part of the recovery process, as experts believe that attempting to reintegrate too quickly into old rhythms could cause additional harm rather than healing. Laura has not returned to work, has not resumed the independent travel lifestyle that was once a significant part of her identity before the disappearance, and does not maintain social relationships tied to that period of her life. This change does not stem from a lack of motivation, but from the recognition that old patterns are no longer compatible with her current psychological state and sense of safety. In daily life, Laura relies significantly on family support, from managing medical schedules, ensuring a stable living environment, to providing emotional support when trauma symptoms unexpectedly resurface. This dependency is viewed as a necessary part of recovery from prolonged trauma, when the capacity for independence must be rebuilt from the most basic foundations, rather than expecting full autonomy in a short time. Over time, Laura has undergone a marked shift in social identity, as her image is no longer tied to the role of an active, freely moving individual open to the outside world, but has transitioned to a discreet, cautious state with limited public presence. She avoids the media, does not participate in activities related to the case, and minimizes sharing her personal story beyond the treatment context, in order to protect the private space necessary for psychological recovery. Experts believe this change reflects an effort to redefine herself according to new boundaries of safety and tolerance, rather than attempting to maintain a social image that is no longer compatible with her lived experience. The low-profile life Laura maintains is not a complete withdrawal from society, but a controlled form of existence, where the pace of life is slowed, environmental factors are carefully selected, and every interaction is weighed, based on current tolerance capacity. Within that framework, Laura is gradually learning to accept that recovery does not mean returning to the person of the past, but building a new, more modest, safer, and more suitable way of living within the limits imposed by prolonged trauma, a process that requires time, patience, and sustained support from those around her. From an overall perspective, the consequences of the case do not stop at establishing criminal responsibility, but extend and persist across multiple dimensions, beginning with the victim herself. For Laura Whitman, the long-term impact is not only evident in the medical and psychological diagnoses already documented, but is present in every daily life choice. The physical injuries have left limitations on mobility, chronic pain, and reduced endurance, turning activities once considered normal into challenges. On the psychological level, a state of heightened vigilance, the fragility of any sense of safety, and anxiety responses that are no longer tied to a specific memory have become a constant emotional baseline. These consequences do not fade away in a linear fashion over time, but fluctuate, sometimes subsiding, sometimes surging, requiring Laura to continually adjust her way of living to adapt. This impact continues to spread to the family, who spent many years in a state of uncertain waiting, living between hope and despair without a clear resolution. When Laura returned, the joy could not be separated from the shock of confronting the reality that their loved one had been permanently changed. The family not only had to take on the role of long-term caregivers, but also had to readjust the entire structure of their relationships, as the boundaries between love, protection, and emotional exhaustion became fragile. The years that were lost cannot be made up, and the feeling of guilt for not having been able to prevent it or uncover the truth sooner frequently emerges, even though rationally, they understand it was not their responsibility. At the community level, the case created a quiet but profound disruption in perceptions of safety, particularly in tourist areas and spaces presumed to be controlled. The fact that an individual could vanish from a crowded location and then be held captive for many years without detection undermines the belief that danger always takes a clear or overtly violent form. The community was forced to confront the reality that severe harmful behaviors can be concealed beneath a normal facade, exploiting gaps in social oversight and reliance on assumptions of safety. At the same time, the case raised difficult questions about the limits of the legal and investigative system. When an initial missing person report was classified as a natural accident and did not trigger the necessary criminal investigation mechanisms in the early stages. Although responsibility cannot be assigned to a single decision, this accumulated delay contributed to prolonging the crime period, revealing that the system still has blind spots when facing forms of crime that do not follow familiar patterns. Even when the subsequent investigation was conducted comprehensively, and the sentence was imposed at the maximum penalty allowed by law, the legal system can only address criminal responsibility. It cannot return the stolen years, cannot completely erase the psychological consequences, and cannot recreate the relationships or life opportunities that were interrupted. This irremediable gap exists at many levels, from Laura's personal memories, where time was fractured and cannot be reconnected, to the family life that has been permanently restructured, and further to the lingering sense of unease in the community, upon realizing that not every danger is recognized in time. Legally, the case is considered closed once criminal responsibility is established, and the sentence takes effect, but this closure exists only within the procedural framework. The real consequences continue far beyond the courtroom, persisting in the bodies, minds, and social lives of those affected, as proof that justice can determine right and wrong and punish criminal acts, but cannot completely erase the traces left by prolonged controlling violence. The story of Laura Whitman is not merely an isolated case, but clearly reflects very real challenges in contemporary American life, where personal freedom, independent travel, and social trust are regarded as self-evident values. Laura disappeared at Antelope Canyon, a crowded managed tourist site, highlighting an important lesson: danger does not always appear in the form of violence or chaos, but sometimes hides in the gaps of trust and assumed safety. In the story, the perpetrator did not use force from the beginning, but exploited an unofficial support role and the image of someone who knows the area to approach Laura. This reminds us that in modern American society, where people are generally open, friendly, and willing to help one another, maintaining awareness of personal boundaries is extremely necessary, especially for those traveling alone. Another lesson lies in how the system responds to missing persons cases. The fact that Laura's file was initially classified under the natural accident hypothesis meant a criminal investigation was not launched early, enabling the prolonged confinement to continue for 4 years. This reflects a reality in the United States. The legal system is very strong when clear evidence is present, but still has blind spots when confronting crimes that do not follow familiar patterns. The lesson here is that communities and authorities need to take unusual signs seriously, even when criminal elements are not yet sufficient, and families of missing persons need to be listened to over the long term, not only in the initial phase. Finally, Laura's post-trauma journey, with prolonged therapy, deliberate social limitation, and a low-profile life, reminds us that being rescued does not equate to returning to the way things were. In American life, where the culture strongly values independence and quick recovery, this story teaches us to be more patient with survivors, to respect their recovery pace, and to understand that sometimes the greatest lesson is not in overcoming, but in learning to continue living with greater compassion and awareness of human vulnerability. If you feel the value of this story, and want to join us in looking deeper into the hidden corners behind cases that seem already closed, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next analyses. Thank you for staying until the end, and see you in the next video, where every story is not only about crime, but also about people, and what remains afterward.